A quiet car ride can turn into one of the most legally confusing moments a person may ever experience. Imagine you're sitting in the passenger seat, maybe chatting with a friend, maybe just looking out the window while music plays softly in the background. The drive feels routine, ordinary, nothing unusual about it. Then suddenly, flashing red and blue lights appear in the rearview mirror. The driver slows down. The car pulls over to the side of the road. The engine idles, and within seconds, a police officer walks toward the vehicle. Most drivers know what happens next. The officer usually asks for a driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. That part is familiar, but something many people are far less prepared for is what happens when the officer turns their attention away from the driver and toward the passenger. Can I see your ID too? For millions of passengers, that simple question creates immediate uncertainty. Are you legally required to show identification if you're not the one driving? Do you have the right to refuse? Could refusing make things worse? Could you get arrested just for saying no? Think about that for a moment. If you were sitting in the passenger seat during a traffic stop and an officer asked for your identification, what would you do? Would you hand it over automatically? Would you ask why? Or would you hesitate, unsure of what the law actually says? If you've ever been in that situation, or if you've ever wondered what the correct response might be, feel free to share your experience in the comments. Many people have faced this exact moment, and every story helps reveal how confusing these encounters can feel in real life. Because the truth is, the law surrounding passengers and identification is one of the most misunderstood areas of everyday policing. To understand why, we first need to step back and look at the legal framework that governs traffic stops in the United States. Traffic stops may feel routine, but legally speaking, they are a form of temporary detention. Under the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, people have the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. A traffic stop qualifies as a seizure under the law, even though it may only last a few minutes. This principle was clarified by the United States Supreme Court in several landmark cases over the years. When police pull over a vehicle, the stop must be justified by reasonable suspicion or probable cause that a traffic violation or crime has occurred. But here's where things become interesting. When a vehicle is stopped, not only is the driver considered detained under the law, but the passengers are also considered temporarily seized for the duration of the stop. That might sound surprising at first. After all, passengers did not commit the driving violation. They may have had no control over the situation at all. Yet legally, because they are inside the vehicle being stopped, the courts have recognized that they are also part of the detention during the encounter. The Supreme Court addressed this issue in a case called Brendlin versus California in 2007. In that decision, the court confirmed that passengers are indeed seized during a traffic stop just like drivers are. But that still doesn't fully answer the question that causes so much confusion. If passengers are technically detained during a traffic stop, does that mean they must identify themselves when an officer asks? The answer is more nuanced than many people expect. Unlike drivers, passengers are usually not required to carry a driver's license or identification. Drivers are required by law to present a license because they are operating the vehicle. Driving is considered a regulated privilege, and the law requires drivers to prove they are legally allowed to operate the car. Passengers, on the other hand, are simply occupants of the vehicle. They are not engaging in the act of driving. Because of that distinction, the legal obligation to present identification does not automatically apply to passengers in the same way it applies to drivers. However, the exact legal answer can depend on several factors, including the specific laws of the state where the stop occurs and the circumstances of the encounter. Some states have what are known as stop and identify laws. These laws allow officers to request identification from individuals during lawful stops if certain conditions are met. One of the most well-known cases related to this issue is Hebel versus 6th Judicial District Court of Nevada, decided by the Supreme Court in 2004. In that case, the court ruled that states with properly written stop and identify statutes can require individuals to state their name during a lawful investigative detention. But even that ruling came with limitations. The court did not say that everyone must carry physical identification. It also did not say officers can demand identification from anyone without justification. Instead, the ruling emphasized that the request must be connected to a lawful stop supported by reasonable suspicion. This means the legal landscape can be complicated. In many everyday traffic stops, passengers are not suspected of any crime. They are simply present in the vehicle. In those situations, courts have often found that passengers are not automatically required to provide identification unless there is reasonable suspicion that the passenger themselves is involved in criminal activity. So when an officer asks a passenger for ID, the question becomes, is this a voluntary request, or is there a legal requirement behind it? Understanding that difference is important. Many people instinctively comply with police requests because they want to avoid conflict or escalation. And in many cases, that instinct is understandable. Traffic stops can feel stressful, and people often just want the situation to end as quickly as possible. But from a legal standpoint, not every request made by an officer carries the force of law. Some requests are exactly that, requests. Others are lawful orders. Knowing the difference can shape how an encounter unfolds. Imagine a typical scenario. A driver is pulled over for speeding. The officer approaches the vehicle and asks for the driver's license and registration. That request is backed by legal authority because drivers are required to present their license when operating a vehicle. Then the officer turns toward the passenger and says, "Can I see your ID as well?" At that moment, the legal basis for the request may be less clear. If the passenger is not suspected of a crime and the state does not have a law requiring identification in that situation, the request may simply be voluntary. This is where legal experts often recommend a calm and respectful response that seeks clarification without creating confrontation. A simple response, sometimes suggested by attorneys, is a polite question such as, "Officer, am I required to provide identification, or is this voluntary?" That question does something important. It asks the officer to clarify whether the request is legally mandatory or simply optional. Notice the tone of that response. It is not argumentative. It is not hostile. It does not accuse the officer of wrongdoing. It simply asks for clarification. In many real-world encounters, that type of calm communication can prevent misunderstandings, because the reality is that most traffic stops are brief interactions where both sides are trying to manage uncertainty. Officers are assessing safety and investigating the situation. Drivers and passengers are trying to understand what their rights and obligations are. Sometimes officers ask passengers for identification for practical reasons, rather than legal ones. For example, they may be trying to determine whether someone in the vehicle has outstanding warrants, or whether the occupants are connected to another investigation. But without reasonable suspicion directed toward the passenger, courts have often been skeptical of detaining or arresting someone solely for refusing to identify themselves. That doesn't mean refusing to identify yourself will always end the interaction quickly. In some cases, officers may continue asking questions or try to determine whether there are grounds for further investigation. This is why many legal educators emphasize maintaining calm, respectful communication throughout the encounter. Aggressive language or confrontation can escalate tension unnecessarily, even when a person is legally within their rights. Think about how quickly misunderstandings can arise during stressful moments. An officer may interpret nervous behavior as suspicious. A passenger may interpret routine questioning as intimidation. Both sides may be reacting to incomplete information. In those moments, tone and clarity can matter as much as legal knowledge. Another important legal concept during traffic stops is officer safety. Courts have recognized that traffic stops can be unpredictable situations for law enforcement. Because of that, officers are given certain powers to manage the environment during the stop. For example, the Supreme Court ruled in Pennsylvania versus Mims that officers may order drivers out of a vehicle during a stop for safety reasons. Later, in Maryland versus Wilson, the court extended that authority to passengers as well. This means passengers may be required to exit the vehicle if an officer orders them to do so. But again, that authority relates to safety during the stop, not automatically to providing identification. Understanding these distinctions can help clarify what is happening during the encounter. The driver has specific legal obligations tied to operating the vehicle. Passengers are temporarily detained during the stop. Officers may take certain steps for safety reasons. But the requirement for passengers to provide identification typically depends on whether there is reasonable suspicion related to that passenger or whether state law specifically requires it. If you've ever watched videos of traffic stops online, you've probably noticed that different encounters can unfold in dramatically different ways. Some stops are calm and straightforward, others become tense or confusing. That's partly because real-world interactions involve human judgment, communication, and interpretation of complex legal standards. One person may immediately hand over identification without thinking about it. Another may ask questions about their rights. Another may remain silent. Each approach can shape how the interaction continues. Legal scholars often emphasize that the Constitution protects individuals from unreasonable government intrusion, but those protections are interpreted through real-world encounters that can be unpredictable. Think about how many Americans interact with law enforcement through traffic stops every year. Millions of stops occur annually across the country. For many people, it may be the only direct encounter they ever have with police. Because of that, these everyday interactions have become an important space where constitutional rights and practical policing intersect. Understanding the law does not mean seeking conflict. In fact, many attorneys emphasize that knowledge can actually reduce conflict by helping people respond calmly and confidently. If you know your rights and responsibilities, you're less likely to panic, argue, or make impulsive decisions during a stressful moment. Imagine again that moment when an officer asks a passenger for identification. Instead of reacting with fear or frustration, a person who understands the law might calmly ask whether providing identification is required. That simple question can bring clarity to the interaction. If the officer explains that the request is voluntary, the passenger can decide whether to comply. If the officer states that there is reasonable suspicion or that state law requires identification, the situation may carry different legal implications. These nuances are exactly why legal education around everyday encounters matters. Many people assume the law is simple and straightforward until they find themselves inside a real situation where the rules are not obvious. And that brings us back to the central question. What should a passenger say when an officer asks for identification during a traffic stop? One of the most widely suggested responses from legal educators is a calm, respectful request for clarification. Something along the lines of, "Officer, am I required by law to provide identification?" That response acknowledges the officer's authority while also seeking to understand the legal basis of the request. It avoids confrontation, it avoids assumptions, and it keeps the conversation grounded in clear communication. Of course, every situation is unique, and laws can vary by jurisdiction. But the broader lesson is that knowledge and calm communication often lead to better outcomes than panic or hostility. As traffic stops continue to be one of the most common interactions between citizens and law enforcement, understanding these principles becomes increasingly valuable. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this: constitutional rights are not just abstract legal concepts written in textbooks. They play out in ordinary moments, on quiet roads, during routine drives, when flashing lights appear behind a car and a simple question is asked. If you found yourself sitting in that passenger seat tonight and an officer leaned toward the window and asked for your identification, how would you respond? Would you hand it over immediately? Would you ask whether it's required? Or would you pause? Remembering that the law surrounding that moment is more complex than many people realize. Share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. Conversations about everyday legal encounters help more people understand how these situations actually work in the real world. Because sometimes the most important legal questions arise not in courtrooms, but on the side of the road, during a conversation that lasts only a few minutes, yet reveals how law, authority, and individual rights intersect in everyday life.